Dozens of Defence Force personnel have packed up and left as police pull the pin on their latest outback search for South Australian boy Gus Lamont. As Lauren Rose reports, it's been almost 3 weeks since the little boy vanished from his home, seemingly without a trace.
First and foremost, our thoughts are with Gus and his family. We would love to have resolution to this matter, but not any more than the family would themselves.
It's the end of the road for authorities here today. They've thrown everything at this latest search, but there's still no sign of 4-year-old Gus Lamont.
On the evening of September 27, 2025, 4-year-old Gus Lamont was last seen playing at the homestead of Oak Park Station, a remote sheep property in South Australia. He vanished within minutes while family members were nearby, and what began as a frantic search for a missing boy quickly transformed into a larger, more complex investigation. The facts that have emerged so far are both simple and stubbornly puzzling. A single set of footprints, a couple of other marks in the dust, an enormous search that turned up nothing definitive, and a line of questioning that now points less at wandering and more at something, or someone else that has yet to step forward. Gus's disappearance reads like a house of mirrors. Every detail refracts the same cold questions. Was he frightened and hidden somewhere? Was he taken? Did he walk away and the land simply fail to keep the memory of him? People who know the outback well insist the ground remembers. Footprints, scuffed grasses, spent twigs, all betray movement. Yet here, the earth has been largely mute. That silence is what has forced investigators to change course and what keeps the story alive in public attention. Below, each of the main developments is explored in depth. What we know about the day he vanished, the footprints that have captured attention, the searches that have swept the station, the theories that have been tested and discarded, and why transparency now matters more than ever. The disappearance of a 4-year-old from his family property is the single bleak fact everything else must orbit. On September 27, 2025, Gus Lamont was playing near his family's homestead at Oak Park Station, about 40 kilometers south of Yunta in South Australia. It was an ordinary spring afternoon, warm and dry, with the kind of quiet that comes from wide open plains. His grandmother last saw him around 5 p.m., playing in a mound of sand close to the house. By 5:30 p.m., when the grandmother called him in and could not find him, the family had begun a search of the immediate area. They searched on their own for some hours before police were notified and a formal search operation began. From the moment the family realized he was missing, every minute mattered. In remote places like Oak Park Station, light falls quickly and distances that look small on a map can be unforgiving on foot. The family says they looked for him before calling authorities. That gap, 3 hours before police were contacted, according to statements released publicly, has been highlighted repeatedly because of what it means for search and rescue timelines. When a young child goes missing, the first 2 hours are often the most critical, and delay can dramatically reduce the chances of finding clear physical traces or eyewitness accounts. Investigators and search experts have worked through the implications of that early timeline. It does not by itself explain what happened, but it frames the limits of what could be expected from the ground searches that followed. One of the most arresting and confusing pieces of evidence in this case is a single set of footprints that appeared to lead away from the homestead and then abruptly stop. It is the sort of image that lodges itself in the public imagination. A child's lone step into a landscape that swallows sound and hides small things beneath dust. Early volunteers and searchers described finding a partial footprint not far from the homestead, a mark they photographed and logged. For a time, some searchers believed this was Gus's footprint, and that it might indicate he walked some distance before the trail ended. But official communications have been cautious. At various points the footprint was described as unconfirmed, then dismissed or reinterpreted by authorities, creating a tangle of public speculation and private frustration among those who combed the land. What makes this footprint so consequential is that it cuts in 2 directions. If the print belonged to Gus, it would indicate he at least moved away from the immediate area and left a physical trace that could be tracked. The question would then shift to where the trail continued and why it stopped. If it did not belong to him, it would suggest someone else was present at that time, possibly barefoot, possibly a small person, and that raises the stakes considerably. Either way, The mark in the dirt suggests movement and presence that are not otherwise supported by the abundance of empty space the search teams found. The footprint has become a pivot in public conversation because it is tangible, small, and perfectly ordinary, and because ordinary things are precisely what this case sorely lacks. Complicating the footprint story is a second print that was reported later, further from the homestead. Police were briefed about a print discovered roughly 3.5 kilometers from the house. At first it was treated as a potential lead, then reassessed. Investigators now believe that this later print was unlikely to be from a child. That distinction matters a great deal because two separate prints at such different distances pull the narrative in competing directions. A print half a kilometer from the home that is plausibly Gus's suggests immediate wandering or displacement nearby. A second print miles away, if not from a child, introduces the possibility of unrelated movement or a mistaken identification. On top of that, search teams have said other early impressions, small depressions, indistinct marks, were logged but later judged to be environmental or from animals rather than human footprints. The practical result of this mixture of findings is a narrowing of reliable ground to hunt upon. Civilian searchers, emergency service volunteers, ADF personnel and police trackers all filtered through the early clues. Many of the initial, hopeful signs did not lead to further discovery. That has been maddening for the community and for relatives who combed the paddocks, convinced one crack in the soil would become a thread back to Gus. And yet the interpretation of those marks has to be conservative. The outback is full of misleading traces, boot prints, tire marks, animal tracks, that can mimic a small barefoot impression, especially after wind, rain, or the repeated passage of search teams. The later official view that the 3.5 kilometer print was probably not from a child is therefore both an attempt to focus limited investigative energy and a source of renewed questions about what else might have been missed or dismissed. A crucial piece of the story, one that has shaped both public reaction and investigative strategy, is the family timeline. According to the family's account, Gus was last seen around 5 p.m. playing outside while relatives were close by, performing everyday tasks. The grandmother was inside with his younger sibling. His mother and another grandparent were reportedly a short distance away tending to the station's sheep. By 5:30 p.m., the grandmother had called him to come in and could not find him. Family members searched, then eventually called police 3 hours after he was first noticed missing. The details of those early hours have been examined and re-examined. Who was where, what each person heard, which gates were open, whether any vehicles had passed, and why a call to police was not made sooner. These are painful inquiries because they press against private grief, yet they are routine lines of inquiry in any missing person case. The passage of time between discovery and police contact has become a focal point for outside observers, who argue that any delay can hamper immediate search and rescue efforts. In a remote property setting, light fades quickly and the environment becomes far more dangerous for a small child. The family's account also raises operational questions investigators must answer. When did the family first attempt a search? How extensive was it? What exactly were the coordinates of every check? And were there any informal sightings that later became clearer with hindsight? Answering those questions matters not to assign blame but to reconstruct the exact conditions in which Gus disappeared. That reconstruction is the backbone of any subsequent investigative step, because without a precise chronology, search efforts risk chasing possibilities rather than following the most promising lines of inquiry. What unfolded next was a search of enormous scale for a sparsely populated region. Over several days and weeks, hundreds of personnel, police, Australian Defence Force members, volunteer search and rescue teams, local trackers and community volunteers, combed the property and surrounding country. Reports reference hundreds of square kilometers reviewed with drones, helicopters, thermal imaging and boots on the ground. Some accounts specify that the operation covered an estimated 470 square kilometers and focused on a 5.5 kilometer radius around the homestead at certain stages. Searchers walked long distances each day, sometimes covering 20 to 25 kilometers on foot, and teams used every resource available: infrared sensors, mounted trackers, ATV and motorbike teams, and aerial support. Despite the scale and intensity, the searches concluded with little to show in the way of material evidence. The relentlessness of that effort deserves careful recognition. It is rare for an area this remote to sustain such concentrated resources for an extended period, and it speaks to both the seriousness with which authorities treated the case and the community's refusal to let the story fade. But the scope of the search also underscores a frustrating reality. Even the most exhaustive human effort can be defeated by environment and time. Wind can erase tiny prints, nocturnal animals can scatter debris, and an initial delay can mean the difference between finding a child's shoe and finding only emptiness. The official statements following the searches have been measured, emphasizing continued commitment while acknowledging the limits of what has been recovered so far. Those limits have forced investigators to shift some of their attention away from immediate physical recovery and toward a more methodical investigative process. Perhaps the most striking absence in all of the groundwork is physical evidence of struggle, an animal attack, or any long-distance wandering. Search coordinators and season trackers have repeatedly said they expected to find signs if Gus had moved a considerable distance by himself or had been attacked in the bush: a hat, a toy, torn clothing, blood, drag marks, or a series of footprints showing a trajectory. None of those decisive markers was found. Senior volunteers and professionals alike voiced surprise at the lack of physical memory in the landscape. Their experience, from tracking livestock to following human trails in scrub, suggested that even the briefest of movements by a small child should have left more behind. The absence of such evidence does not prove any single theory. It only narrows the plausible explanations. It makes a wandering alone scenario harder to accept without additional corroboration, and it increases the likelihood that human action, whether intentional or accidental, played a role in what happened. Investigators must balance that uncomfortable inference against the need for proof. Suspicion cannot substitute for evidence in a case that will ultimately require legal conclusions. Still, when an environment that normally speaks loudly remains silent, it naturally forces attention toward the people who were present and the movements they made within that crucial half hour. That reorientation, from search and rescue toward formal investigation, is not merely semantic. Police shifted the language they used in public statements, and a dedicated unit, known in reports as Task Force Horizon, was formed to take a closer investigative lead on the case. Where early messaging emphasized recovery and hope, the decision to create a task force signaled a more deliberate, evidence-focused approach, collecting witness statements, re-examining early logged clues, tracing movements of vehicles and people near the station, and processing any digital or physical material seized during inquiries. The creation of a task force usually follows when investigators sense that missing person protocols alone will not suffice and that forensic, intelligence, and detective work must be layered in. This development has two implications. Practically, it means different skill sets and resources are being applied: interview teams, digital forensics, and dedicated detectives, with the expectation of following leads that may be months or years old. Psychologically, it marks a change in tone for those following the case. Hope of immediate recovery becomes tempered by the recognition that the truth may lie in patterns and testimony rather than an obvious physical artifact. Police have been careful in public to avoid declaring foul play without evidence, but the investigative posture reflects the reality that when the landscape yields no clear answers, the people who were present that day become the central source of knowledge. Voices from the local search effort and nearby community have also weighed in on what the station's environment can and cannot tell investigators. A volunteer who knows the property well told reporters he was certain the child could not still be on the land, arguing that local animals like wedge-tailed eagles, wild pigs, or feral dogs were not present in the numbers that would account for a sudden disappearance. That testimony has been used to argue against wildlife-based explanations and to reinforce the idea that the ground would show traces if a small child had been carried away by an animal or had wandered far. At the same time, authorities have cautioned against assuming perfect local knowledge is dispositive. Environments change, and rare events do occur. Still, community input has been a vital resource, providing context about paddock layout, water sources, tracks, and human movement that only locals could supply. This local perspective sits alongside official appeals from police for patience and for the public to avoid spreading unverified or sensational claims. Authorities have repeatedly asked people not to share possible misinformation that can sidetrack inquiries, a warning underscored by fact-checkers who noted false images and stories circulating after Gus went missing. Investigative teams must sift through a vast amount of public chatter as they attempt to identify credible leads, and that process is complicated by the speed at which misinformation can travel. For a family already living through unimaginable uncertainty, the swirl of accurate and inaccurate reports can be an unwanted second assault. Finally, the public question that runs beneath every development is this: what more should be done to find answers? Those following the case have called for transparency, the release of every photograph, every drone scan, every footprint image and early witness note, on the argument that armed with more information, experts and the public might generate new leads. Advocates say that in some investigations, crowdsourcing insight or simply allowing more eyes to view material can reveal patterns missed by official teams. Police understandably weigh public safety and the integrity of an investigation when deciding what to release. Too much disclosure can compromise lines of inquiry or alert persons of interest. But in missing child cases, where time and community memory are precious, a careful balance is necessary. What the family and the public have asked for is not spectacle, it is clarity. They want the facts laid bare enough that independent observers can help pursue every plausible line. Even small details, a time-stamped photo, a grainy drone still, a log of vehicle movements, can be the key that turns a cold lead warm. Above all, those who loved Gus want persistence. Not momentary public attention but steady pressure that refuses to accept silence as an answer. The footprint, whether Gus's or not, is emblematic of that plea. A small, ordinary mark that insists on being explained. Until it is, the story remains unfinished. This is where we end today's report and where the real work begins for everyone who cares about finding the truth. Keep asking questions, keep sharing accurate information, and if you have anything at all that might help investigators, bring it forward to the authorities. Gus's family has been living with impossible uncertainty. They deserve every resource and every conscientious eye trained on this case. The land has not offered a clear answer, and until every footprint is accounted for and every timeline is confirmed, this story will not allow the comfort of closure. Remember to subscribe and turn on the bell to stay updated as this investigation continues to unfold. Keep Gus's name alive in conversation, and if you are someone who can help, by offering a memory, a photograph, or a tip, do it now. Silence helps no one. Persistence very well might.